It started with a choice. A small one, at least in my mind. I just moved in a neighborhood, boxes still stacked in the hallway, the scent of fresh paint still clinging to the walls. After years of chaos and hard-earned recovery, this place felt like my fresh chapter. I wasn't looking to stand out. I just wanted a clean, functional home. So when it came time to replace the old, dented mailbox that hung crooked on its post like a weary old man, I picked something simple. Sleek, matte black steel. No flowers. No frills. Just clean lines and a locking compartment to keep my mail safe. I didn't know that one mailbox could ignite a war. The first note appeared in my mailbox like a curse. Thin paper, formal letterhead, signed with the seal of the Homeowners Association. Non-compliant mailbox installation. That was all it said. No greeting, no name, no offer of assistance. Just a demand. Remove it and replace it with one that adhered to neighborhood standards. A quick scan of the rulebook, the one I hadn't yet bothered to read, said mailboxes should be neutral in tone, post-mounted, with community-consistent styling. Community-consistent styling. A phrase so vague it could be twisted into anything. I thought it was a misunderstanding. Surely someone had made a mistake. I walked around the block, counted 6 different mailbox styles within 10 homes. One had peeling white paint and rust stains. Another leaned so far forward it looked like it was praying. Mine stood straight, solid, brand new. I sent an email back, polite, curious, offering photos of my walk and asking for clarification. No response, just another letter, then a fine. They fined me over the mailbox. It wasn't about color. It wasn't about design. It was about control. I didn't know it yet, but this mailbox was the matchstick that would set off an inferno. I tried to reason with them, asked to attend the next board meeting. They declined, said it wasn't on the agenda, said they'd review it later. I got another letter the next week, then another fine, and I started to realize this wasn't about the box. This was about me. The moment I chose something different, not even flashy, just different, I was marked. Outsider. Newcomer. Someone who hadn't been welcomed properly by the board. I started noticing things. My trash can moved just slightly. My recycling bin, tagged with a sticky note saying visible from street. Kids who used to wave stopped making eye contact. Neighbors closed garage doors a little faster when I walked by. The mailbox was just the excuse. What they wanted was obedience. They wanted me to tear it down with my own hands, to acknowledge their power, to fall in line. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I started reading. Every rule, every clause. I stayed up late with coffee and a highlighter, flipping through their bylaws like I was studying for war. The more I read, the more I realized how flimsy it all was. How full of loopholes, inconsistencies, contradictions. They relied on fear, on silence, on no one ever questioning the fine print. But the mailbox stood. Every morning, I'd walk out, stand in front of it, and smile at the camera I knew was pointed at my house. It became a monument, a line in the sand, a message to them. I wasn't going anywhere. They tried to make an example out of me, but I didn't break. Instead, I began digging deeper, filing requests, asking questions, and behind the curtain of authority and formality, I found what I expected, a mess. Missing meeting minutes, unfiled permits, board members who hadn't lived in the neighborhood in years but still voted, rules enforced at random, favors handed to friends. They weren't just targeting me, they were ruling by intimidation. And all of it had started because I installed a mailbox. A black one, a quiet one, a functional one. But to them, it was a declaration, a challenge, a threat to their fragile empire of garden flags and matching shutters. It didn't stop at the mailbox. Once the HOA realized I wouldn't comply, they escalated. It started slow, like a dripping faucet, one fine, then another. At first, it was almost laughable. Violation. Lawn exceeds height regulation by 1.5 inches. I checked it myself, measured it, took photos. It was short, green, neat. No one else on the street had gotten a notice. But I had. That was the pattern. They weren't enforcing rules. They were using them as weapons. They turned the rulebook into a tool of punishment, a blunt instrument meant to beat me into obedience. Every day became a game of inspection. I'd come home from work and find a new letter taped to my front door or folded in my mailbox like a silent threat. The color of my curtains, the angle of my satellite dish, the length of time my garbage can spend on the curb after pickup. The notices never stopped. The fines piled up. They were no longer about rules. They were messages. What they wanted was submission. I started documenting everything. I took photographs of every so-called violation, every square inch of my yard, my siding, my driveway. I made a spreadsheet. Each fine, each timestamp, each letter logged. Because deep down, I knew what they were doing wasn't about community upkeep. It was about breaking me down, one nitpicky infraction at a time. They were trying to drown me in paper cuts. But I refused to bleed. Still, they didn't let up. In fact, the campaign intensified. I was summoned to a compliance hearing. Just me. No one else. Not the guy 2 houses down whose yard was an overgrown jungle. Not the family on the corner whose truck was parked on the lawn every weekend. Just me. The hearing was held in a fluorescent lit room behind the clubhouse, a place that felt more like a courtroom than a community space. 5 board members sat behind a long table. None of them smiled. One of them didn't even look up. I stood there like I was on trial, and they read out a list of offenses like I was a criminal. Violation of exterior color code. Unapproved modifications to front yard. Failure to respond to formal notice. Each line they read felt absurd. I asked to see the color code. I asked to see the list of approved yard modifications. They couldn't produce it. I asked why I was being fined for things others did freely. They didn't answer. Because there was no answer. Not one they'd admit out loud. The rules weren't made to be followed. They were made to be used. Selectively. Quietly. As tools of pressure and punishment. What they were doing was legal on paper. They had the bylaws to hide behind. But it wasn't fair. It wasn't just. And it wasn't equal. They were using the system to push me out. That was when I realized how deep it went. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were manipulating them. They used language as a shield, policies as a sword. And the moment I stood up to them, the moment I refused to change my mailbox, they decided I had to be made an example of. My neighbors saw it too. Some whispered their support when no one else was around. Some nodded in passing. One even slipped a handwritten note into my mailbox that read, "They did the same thing to us. Stay strong." But no one spoke out publicly. No one stood beside me in the hearing. Because they were scared. They'd seen what happened when someone didn't fall in line. I left that room more convinced than ever. This wasn't about community. It was about control. And they thought I would fold. They thought the pressure, the shame, the endless harassment would wear me down. They believed I'd eventually rip out that mailbox, repaint the walls, and beg for forgiveness. But every fine they sent, every letter they taped to my door, only fueled the fire. They weren't enforcing peace. They were creating enemies. They didn't understand that some people don't bend. Some people fight back, even when it's just over a mailbox. Because by now, it wasn't about the mailbox at all. It's strange how quickly a neighborhood can turn cold. One moment, you're waving at people as you pull into your driveway, sharing polite smiles, accepting cookies from someone who says, "Welcome to the neighborhood," like they mean it. Then suddenly, the smiles vanish. Garage doors close a little faster. Conversations stop when you approach. People who once offered help now pretend they don't see you at all. At first, I told myself it was in my head, that I was being paranoid, that maybe people were just busy, but the pattern grew too obvious to ignore. I'd step outside and feel the silence shift. Neighbors who used to wave would glance at my house and quickly look away. Children who used to laugh on their bikes began to swerve around my driveway like it was marked with danger tape. It wasn't paranoia. It was something else. A quiet, coordinated isolation. It wasn't long before I learned that stories were being told. False ones. Twisted ones. According to the whispers, I was the difficult. It didn't matter that I was polite, respectful, quiet. It didn't matter that I paid every fee on time, kept my lawn clean, waved at every neighbor I passed. What mattered was that I had defied the board. And in their eyes, that made me dangerous. I began to feel it in everything. I'd enter the community clubhouse, and conversations would falter. I'd sign up for a community garden plot and find out later it had already been reassigned. I tried volunteering for the annual block party and was told the planning committee was already full. At every turn, I was being shut out. Not officially, not in writing, but in every quiet, strategic way they could manage. The worst part wasn't the fines or the letters or even the HOA board themselves. It was the neighbors who'd once smiled at me, now treating me like I was something to be feared. As if standing up for myself had made me untrustworthy. As if not blindly obeying made me a threat. I wasn't just the person with the wrong mailbox anymore. I was the outsider, the enemy of the good order they believed in. That's the power the HOA held, not just over rules and regulations, but over perception, over people. They knew how to build narratives, how to cast someone in the role of villain without ever getting their hands dirty. They didn't need to shout or confront me in public. They just had to plant the idea that I was a problem and let the rest happen on its own. It wasn't just psychological, it was strategic. The isolation was part of the pressure. If I felt alone, I might fold. If I saw no allies, I might give in. They wanted me to feel like the neighborhood had rejected me, not because of them, but because of my own supposed refusal to follow the rules. It was manipulation dressed up as order. I remember the day I realized how complete the isolation had become. I was walking my dog past a house where two women were chatting on the porch. I smiled, nodded, and said, "Good morning." They fell silent. One glanced at the other, then both turned away like I hadn't spoken. Not even glanced back. That day, the weight of it all sank in. I wasn't just being punished by the HOA. I was being erased. But even then, I didn't give up. Because deep beneath the silence, I knew I wasn't wrong. I knew I hadn't done anything to deserve this. And I started to wonder how many others had gone through the same thing. How many had left quietly? How many had given in? How many had looked around at the smiling faces and felt the same cold edge of exclusion I now lived with every day? The mailbox had started the battle. The fines had escalated it. But the isolation, that was their most effective weapon. Not loud, not visible, just quiet pressure. Constant, deliberate, and suffocating. Eventually, the truth starts to show through the cracks. When people cling too tightly to power, they get sloppy. And in their desperation to enforce control, the board overplayed their hand. I began to notice things that didn't add up, small inconsistencies at first, but enough to raise questions. If I was being fined for my mailbox, why wasn't Mr. Clark's crooked, rusted one flagged? If my yard was too wild, how did the overgrown jungle down the street pass inspection every month? There was no consistency, no fairness. Just selective enforcement cloaked in official-looking letters. So I started paying attention. I walked the neighborhood in the early mornings with a camera, documenting everything. Not just my house, but every house. Mailboxes, lawns, driveways, sidewalks, satellite dishes, paint colors. I kept records. I compared them to the violations I had received. The disparity was staggering. There were dozens of properties with issues worse than mine. Some that had been that way for years. But no fines, no letters, no hearings, no pressure. The rules weren't the issue. The people were. One afternoon, I attended an HOA meeting, not because I was invited, but because I had the right to be there. It was cold and impersonal. The board sat at the front of the room, papers in hand, speaking in clipped legal tones. When I asked about specific fines and how violations were determined, they offered vague responses. Case by case. Standard compliance checks. Community values. It was a script. A fog of language meant to confuse and deflect. But I kept pressing. That's when I noticed a shift. There was a flicker of discomfort. A sideways glance between two board members. One cleared his throat and moved on quickly. They hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. Most people didn't question them. Most people just paid the fines and moved on. But I wasn't most people, and I wasn't going anywhere. The more I dug, the more I found. I submitted formal information requests, combed through meeting minutes, and found that many of them weren't even properly recorded. Budgets were vague. Approvals happened behind closed doors. Decisions were made without full transparency. And then came the biggest revelation. Some board members were enforcing rules they themselves were violating. One had installed a custom patio cover without approval. Another had repainted their shutters in a color not on the approved palette. And yet none of them had ever received a single fine. It was favoritism. clear, bold, and shameless. Even more disturbing was how those in the board's good graces seemed to benefit. Friends of the president received fast approvals for additions and renovations, while others waited months for a simple paint request. Some were granted waivers. Some were told rules didn't apply because of special circumstances. It was a club, not a governance structure. A petty empire run by a handful of people using the rulebook as a weapon and a shield. And they thought no one was paying attention. I began to speak with other residents. Quietly, carefully. Many had stories. Some had tried to fight back, only to find themselves buried in bureaucracy. One woman had moved away after being harassed for a garden she planted in her front yard. Another man had racked up thousands in fines over minor infractions that seemed fabricated. No one wanted to go public. They were afraid, but they were angry, and that anger mattered. The HOA liked to talk about community standards, but those standards only applied to the people they wanted to control. Their friends, their allies, their inner circle. They lived by a different set of rules entirely. It wasn't about uniformity. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about power and who got to wield it. They wore civility like a mask. Their meetings, their letters, their announcements, all dressed in polite language. But behind it was something colder, something sharper, a culture of quiet intimidation and backdoor deals. And for the first time, I saw them for what they were, not protectors of the neighborhood, but self-appointed monarchs playing house with real consequences. The rulebook was never sacred to them. It was a tool, and as long as no one questioned it, they could use it however they wanted. But I had started asking questions, and now others were too. The illusion of order was starting to fray, and all it took was a black mailbox, a refusal to bow, and a mind unwilling to be bullied into silence. The rulebook had always been their sacred text. Thin, spiral-bound, filled with language that sounded like it had been written by a lawyer with a grudge. It sat on every homeowner's shelf, usually untouched, collecting dust. But to the board, it was gospel, a tool they wielded like scripture, interpreting it however they pleased, bending its meaning when necessary, weaponizing it when useful. For months, I lived under the weight of that book, its pages quoted in every letter, its rules used to justify every fine, every accusation, every veiled threat. But something in me shifted. It wasn't just the injustice. It was the exhaustion. The feeling of being hunted in my own home, of living under surveillance, of watching neighbors avoid my gaze like I carried a disease. I had followed the rules. I had asked questions. I had tried, in every civilized way, to defend myself. And it hadn't mattered. They didn't want resolution. They wanted submission. So I decided to do something they never expected. I stopped playing their game. I stopped replying to their letters. I stopped attending their meetings. I stopped treating their threats like law. Instead, I focused on building my own case, not just for myself, but against them. I reviewed every line of that rulebook, and where they saw power, I saw weakness. Vague language, contradictions, policies written decades ago that no longer matched the realities of the neighborhood. Rules that gave the board authority, but also exposed them, if anyone bothered to look close enough. And I did. I printed out every violation notice I'd received and compared it to the rulebook's actual wording. I found loopholes. I found clauses that required proper procedure they never followed. I discovered that several of the fines issued against me were technically invalid because the board hadn't documented their inspections properly or because they had skipped a required warning step. I found inconsistencies in how they handled appeals. I found provisions that had been added without a community vote, making them legally questionable. The more I uncovered, the more I realized they weren't just bullies, they were sloppy ones. Arrogant in their authority, lazy in their governance, confident that no one would ever challenge them. They thought the rulebook was fireproof, that no one could touch it, but they had never dealt with someone who read every line. So I made a decision, a symbolic one. One night, I set up a fire pit in my backyard, the same backyard they had cited me for having improper lighting and unapproved fixtures. I took their letters, one by one, and dropped them into the flame. The warnings, the fines, the formal language, the signatures that carried weight only because they believed they did. And then I took my extra copy of the HOA rulebook, the one I had marked, highlighted, dissected, and tossed it in after. The flames rose. Pages curled. Legal jargon turned to ash. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't rebellion. It was clarity. They had tried to ruin my life over a mailbox. Over control. Over power. But I had learned something far more valuable than any rule they could cite. I had learned that their power only existed because we gave it to them. Because we believed in the myth of the rulebook. Because we were too tired, too busy, or too afraid to challenge it. But once you stop believing, once you realize the emperor has no clothes, everything changes. I didn't stop there. I compiled my research. I gathered testimonies from other residents who had been quietly harassed, fined, or excluded. I submitted formal complaints to the state housing department. I reached out to legal aid groups that specialize in HOA abuse. I posted my findings in the community forum, not as rants, but as questions. Simple ones. Why was this rule applied to me, but not to 3 other homes? Why are board meeting minutes incomplete for the last 2 years? Why does the board president have a structure on their property that was never approved? Each post planted doubt. Each question opened eyes. And the board, once so sure of themselves, started to squirm. They responded with deflections. They called emergency meetings. They tried to discredit me. But the damage was done. The rulebook no longer held the weight it once did. People had seen it burn, both literally and metaphorically. The illusion of order, of fairness, of absolute authority was gone. And in its place stood something they couldn't control: awareness, resistance, and the first flickers of real change. Power doesn't just disappear. When you take it from the people who've clung to it for too long, it has to go somewhere. After months of being targeted, isolated, and harassed, I realized the HOA hadn't just been enforcing rules. They had been gatekeeping control. They had created a system where decisions were made behind closed doors, where residents had no voice, where authority rested in the hands of a few who answered to no one. And the only way to stop it wasn't just to burn the rulebook, it was to take their place at the table. I started by reading the bylaws, not as a victim, but as a candidate. I learned the process, the timelines, the rules for nomination. Most people don't know that in many communities, board members are elected by shockingly low turnout. Often, only a handful of votes decide who gets to control the entire neighborhood. That's how the wrong people stay in power, because no one shows up to stop them. So I showed up. At the next annual meeting, I submitted my name as a candidate for the HOA board. No one expected it. Not the board members, not the neighbors, not even me, really. I was still the guy with the black mailbox, the one who had dared to challenge the system. But now I was something else too. The person who'd proven the system was broken. And people had noticed. I started having quiet conversations. I knocked on doors. I talked to neighbors not about rule books or revenge, but about community, about what it could look like if everyone had a voice. If transparency wasn't just a word on a website. If rules were applied fairly. If the board worked for the neighborhood, not over it. People listened. Some were skeptical. Some were exhausted. But more than anything, people were ready for change. They just didn't know it was possible until someone showed them it was. When election day came, I stood in a small room with folding chairs and stale coffee, facing the very people who had tried to push me out. I gave a short speech. I didn't mention the mailbox. I didn't list my grievances. I just talked about accountability, fairness, and restoring trust. I talked about making the HOA a body that served the residents, not ruled them. And then we voted. I won. Not by a landslide, but by enough. Enough to secure a seat. Enough to have a say. Enough to start. My first board meeting as a member was surreal. I sat beside the same people who had written the fines, signed the warnings, and whispered their judgments. They avoided eye contact. They shuffled papers. But they couldn't ignore me anymore. I had earned my place, not by playing their game, but by surviving it. And now, the rule book that had once been used to keep me out was in front of me, open, exposed, and finally within my control. I started asking the questions they never wanted to answer. I demanded transparency in financials. I pushed for public posting of minutes. I motioned to create a resident oversight committee, made up of volunteers from the community to review complaints and violations before any fines were issued. I proposed reforms to the approval process, timelines, documented inspections, photographic evidence. No more secret punishments. No more favoritism. No more hiding behind vagueness. There was resistance, of course. The old guard tried to stall. They brought up traditions, warned of losing order, whispered about how we've always done things this way. But the difference now was that people were watching. I made sure of it. Residents started showing up to meetings. They started reading the bylaws. They started voting, attending, asking. The fear that had once kept them quiet was gone. Because if I could stand up, if I could fight back and win, so could they. It didn't happen overnight. Change never does. But step by step, the culture shifted. The board meetings got louder, more honest, more uncomfortable, yes, but also more real. The neighborhood that had once closed its doors to me began to open them. People I'd never spoken to before stopped me on the sidewalk to thank me, to ask questions, to share their own stories. I was no longer the outsider. I was a representative, a neighbor, a voice they trusted. Taking over the HOA didn't mean revenge. It meant responsibility. It meant proving that power could be used differently, that rules could protect, not punish, that leadership could be shared. It meant turning the very system they had used against me into something new, something better. And as I sat at that table, surrounded by the pages of a rulebook I once feared, I finally understood what real change looks like. It looks like taking back the story and rewriting it together.